Good evening and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content from across the community every single week. I am Joe Hyman, the young JW3 programmer, and if you've just joined our online community, we are a one-of-a-kind Jewish community centre in London that's open to all. We are partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. We will be reopening on Thursday, the Thursday next week, when the lockdown lifts in London. So please join us for an event in building or online if you're still shielding. This series will ask educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You can ask your own questions on the live feed on Facebook and YouTube and here in the webinar. And if you're watching tonight, comment on our feed and say hello. This is actually our penultimate episode of It Says What. We've got one more after this with Jacqueline Nichols. It's been a long run. We've had a wonderful audience. But if you're a regular, let us know a highlight of the program for you over the past year. What's it meant for you to watch It Says What over the past few months? We'd love to hear from you. But for this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Rabbi Benji Stanley, the Rabbi of Westminster Synagogue, an independent synagogue in the middle of London. He lives in London with his partner, Leah Jordan, a previous It Says What speaker. He studied English literature for his first degree, and his Judaism builds on his passion for the written word and inspires him to live meaningfully. Benji, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's Thanksgiving as well. I'm part American, Leah entirely American. So we're looking forward to celebrating that tonight.
Fantastic. Anything specific you're grateful for today?
Torah, Joe. It's been a lifeline during these times.
Yeah, that's the perfect answer for It Says What. So tell us, what is the text that has made you go, It Says What?
So the text that has made me say what it says what is actually a single claim in the Talmud from a rabbi called Rabbi Simlai, who was a 3rd century rabbi, partly based in the land of Israel, although also spending time in Babylonia. And I was intrigued by this statement that I'll really get into in one moment that you've put up there. And I want to say why I was intrigued by this statement partly, which is that the statement raises questions about the relationship between learning and being good in the world, between learning and morality. Now, I love learning. I think I've always loved learning. And especially as I got older, I found a home for that love of learning in my Judaism and in a love of Torah. And I think Judaism tends to really prize learning. We have It Says What, Torah engagement as a response to these times. With our partners Limmud, there's a huge love of learning, people getting together in these conferences and poring over texts. And I think we might therefore assume deep down in our sort of Jewish cultural DNA that learning leads to moral good behavior. But of course, this assumption is unstable. To give the starkest example, I'm always struck and haunted by the fact that at the Wannsee conference in January 1942, when the final solution was discussed, that 8 of the 16 German high officials had PhDs, and Goebbels had 3 PhDs. So the assumption that learning is so fundamentally important that it leads to good in the world feels to me to be an unstable assumption. And I think this claim from Rabbi Simlai, will find, both raises the question of what's the relationship between learning and morality, and also, I'm going to suggest, provides some answers for how learning can be moral. So, Drash Rabbi Simlai. Rabbi Simlai said or interpreted, Torah techilatai gemilut hasadim v'sofa gemilut hasadim. Rabbi Simlai said, the beginning of Torah is the act of loving kindness, and the end of Torah is the act of loving kindness. And at this point in Rabbi Simlai's statement, we might wonder if he's talking about Torah begadol, Torah in a big sense, as the process of learning and Jewish wisdom begins and ends with loving kindness, or whether this is a claim about content. And then as the teaching develops, it seems that Rabbi Simlai is making a claim about content. So he says, "Tchilat Gemut Hasadim diktiv v'ya'as Adonai Elohim la'adam u'lishto kotnot or v'yalbishem." The beginning of Torah is the act of loving kindness, because at the beginning of the 5 books, the eternal ultimate made for Adam and his wife clothes for their skin and dressed them. V'sofa Gemut Hasadim, and its end is the act of loving kindness. As it is written, he buried him in the valley. And this seems to suggest that God's self buried Moses in the valley at the end of the Torah. So Rabbi Simlai has said that the Torah begins with an act of loving kindness and it ends with an act of loving kindness. And I became interested in this text partly when I started to think, wait, what exactly is Rabbi Simlai claiming? So in a moment, like any good drush, Rabbi Simlai is inviting us to interrogate the sources of his interpretation, to go to the Torah and see what we make of these sources. And we'll do that in a moment. And just before we consider, is the beginning of the Torah an act of loving kindness and is the end an act of loving kindness? Let's just touch for a moment upon what is an act of loving kindness. So earlier on this page of Talmud in Tractate Sota, a few moments in the Torah are listed, including these moments, and we get a sense that an act of loving kindness might include visiting the sick, comforting the mourner, as we have here, clothing the naked, which has 2 possible associations, I think, could imply clothing babies, essentially, or helping the poor, clothing the poor, and then also burying the dead or accompanying the dead body. These could all be seen as acts of loving kindness. And we might say that generally acts of loving kindness involve some kind of sitting with the vulnerable, making time for the vulnerable, perhaps in your own vulnerability too. So what is Rabbi Simlai saying about these 2 moments in Torah? If we see the first moment, the beginning of Torah is the act of loving kindness, Rabbi Simlai tells us. So let's look for a moment at the very beginning of the Torah. So here on the left side of the page, we have some verses, which are those moments when the divine clothes humanity. And I want us to be thinking, how does this function as an act of loving kindness? Is it instinctively an act of loving kindness? So what do we see here? Uladam amar, to the human, the divine said, because you listened to the voice of your wife and you ate from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from, the earth will be cursed because of you. In pain or by hard work, you will eat all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles will spring up for you, and you will eat from the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread until you return to the ground that from it you were taken, because you are dust, and to dust you will return. And the man called his wife Chava because she was the mother of all that were living. And here we have the moment that Rabbi Simlai talks about. And the eternal ultimate made for Adam and his wife clothes for their skin and dressed them. And then a few verses later, the divine drove out, exiled the human and placed him east of Eden, with the cherubim there guarding the way back. So, what is Rabbi Simlai saying? I mean, this is kind of my it says what feeling about the text. We could say, here we have an act of loving kindness. The Torah begins with an act of loving kindness because the divine clothes Adam and Eve. But we could also very naturally and instinctively say, what? The divine clothes Adam and Eve, having cast them out into a world of exile and death, on account of a transgression of a commandment that even some rabbinic literature describes as a light command. So Rabbi Simlai seems to have chosen as this opening archetypal moment of loving kindness something that on the surface could feel incredibly hard, incredibly severe. And then we look at the other moment that Rabbi Simlai points us to as the Torah ending with the act of loving kindness. And again, let's look at this and think, how is this an act of loving kindness? And also, what difference and similarities can we find in the end of the Torah here to the passage we just read to the beginning? So here are a few verses on the right of your source sheet there. Moses went up Me'arvot Moab, from the steppes of Moab, to Har Nevo, to the Mount Nevo. He went up to the head of the summit, such that he was facing Jericho, and the Eternal showed him all the land of Gilead until Dan. And the Eternal said to him, this land that I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your seed I will give it to you, I am showing it to you with your eyes, but you will not cross into it. And Moses died there, a servant of the Eternal, in the land of Moab, al pi Adonai, by the command or by the mouth of the Eternal. And then we have the moment that Rabbi Simlai quotes, and vayikbor oto v'gai. So it seems this is saying God buried him in the valley. I mean, some translations do want to read this, by the way, vayikaber oto, because it seems so counterinstinctive that God would personally bury. So they read it as slightly awkwardly, he was buried in the valley, but it doesn't really work with the grammar, in the land of Moab. So here we have this other moment, this archetypal moment of loving kindness. And again, we might ask, what? I mean, sure, the divine buries Moses in the valley, having just condemned Moses to death, to perennial exile, never crossing over into his life's work. And again, as with the beginning of the Torah, this has happened arguably on the basis of a momentary lapse, what could be considered a momentary lapse in transgressing a fairly baffling commandment, arguably. So, what is Rabbi Simlai teaching us? What is he teaching us about loving kindness, and what is he teaching us about Torah? And what I want to suggest is, if we really think about these two episodes, we can see that, first of all, when it comes to loving kindness and our engagement with Torah, Rabbi Simlai, in highlighting these episodes, might be highlighting the importance of confronting difficulty and pain in developing behavior of loving kindness. Franz Kafka said of texts that a text must be an axe to break the frozen sea inside of us. And in our confronting these passages, we're confronting starkly suffering, severity, unfairness, difficulty, pain, death. And I hope that it can draw out from me compassion, that it can open me up, break me open. Secondly, and I think this is really the heart of Rabbi Simlai's teaching, it seems that Rabbi Simlai is teaching us that what loving kindness at its heart is confronting that difficulty or pain and maintaining commitment or relationship in the face of it. And Rabbi Simlai seems to be applying that loving kindness to the Torah, as well as suggesting that this is a dynamic between people. So Rabbi Simlai does exactly what we see as loving kindness with the text. He sits with the difficulties. He's determined to draw out from that which is painful and difficult the positive for how to be a better person in the world. So we see here that Torat Chesed, a learning of loving kindness, can actually describe a way of reading, a hermeneutic, if you like, a way of interacting with text, determined to maintain relationship commitment and draw the best out of pain in the face of vulnerability. We also see in Rabbi Simlai highlighting the beginning and the end in these two episodes, Rabbi Simlai emphasizes that the Torah begins with the clothing of those babies of humanity, and it ends with the burying of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher in the valley, with the burying of a human being. And I think in this highlighting, we can be invited to understand that the Torah can teach us to simply pay more attention to the brevity of a single human's life and their vulnerability and their need for loving kindness within this brevity and vulnerability. And finally, we see in these two texts just how hands-on that commitment of loving kindness is with the Torah and with other people. The divine was not too great to do the frontline work of stitching clothing for babies. Right? And nor was the divine too great to get involved with the physical caring of a human deceased body. And so we see that Chesed involves a humility that can invert assumed hierarchy and power, replacing these with possibility as we come together in our vulnerability. So why is this text especially important to me, just to begin, to return to the beginning? So, you know, when I was 13 or 14, I went to I started going to a high pressure school. It involved a lot of travel, and it made me fairly anxious, I think, for a couple of years. Mild stomach aches, trying to get a sense of myself. And I began to really love the world of literature, stories, text, as a way of listening carefully and thinking about what one wants to say in the world. And at this age, when I was 13 or 14, my late father, Jack Stanley, may his memory be a blessing, he was already 70. And because I was beginning to love words and language and literature, I started reading all my essays to him. Every couple of weeks, I would go in to the living room and read my piece to him. And he would ask me, wait, what are you saying there? That doesn't seem clear. We would argue. I would get upset. I would storm out, even though I had initiated it. I would make the changes he suggested, and then I would return with the changes he had suggested and read the piece, and we would talk about it. And those were moments of great pride for myself and for my father. And I think, even though the content wasn't Jewish, those moments actually intimated to me exactly what I look for in Judaism. Which is a learning of loving kindness, a commitment to the person in front of you that reinforces your commitment to wisdom, and a commitment to wisdom that reinforces your commitment to kindness to the people in front of you and around you. And I think this is a culture that can develop moral learning. If we in Judaism are learning in a way that's oriented to the person in front of us, if we're learning together as we are now, if we're learning in a way that's oriented to action, to kindness indeed, and if we're oriented to orality as well, to aliveness of the text, Rabbi Simlai would have been unlikely to come up with that drush, with that interpretation, if he just read the passage on his Facebook feed. But because in a very written culture, we risk being stuck in our echo chambers, we risk deadening the words, rather than bringing what Mendelssohn described as the spirit of living conversation. So I think this is our job now, to feel and build the spirit of living conversation, and all the more in these moments where there is much pain, loneliness, vulnerability. I want to find in Rabbi Simlai's teaching the ability to find in our Torah and in our life the resolve for ongoing commitment, company, creativity, and loving kindness.
Thanks, Benji. That's really beautiful. That kind of spirit of loving kindness, and that image of an oral culture, in contrast with I guess the kind of written culture of online sharing of Facebook statuses and various different things, is so poignant and interesting to me. And it's really struck me in the moment. I wanted to understand the process of how you took your eye of good, kind of looking at this text through this good eye, and how you went from being surprised by it to connecting with it. What was that process look like for you? Because I think people watching tonight, if they read that Rabbi Simlai text and then they saw the source text, if they took the effort to look at the source text, which is who knows if people would do that, but if they did, I think they'd be stumped. They'd be, well, why are these the texts? What was the process that it took for you to get to the stage of actually there's meaning here?
Yeah. So I always loved, Jay, the initial teaching that Torah begins and ends with the act of loving kindness. And I always assumed that it was simply about process, essentially what Rabbi Simlai is saying, which is that if you've got to come to Torah determined to bring out loving kindness, and then you will bring out loving kindness. And that general phrase was taught to me, I'm pretty certain, by Rabbi Shai Held kind of 10 years ago at this wonderful place of learning in New York at Hadar. And, and it helped that there's a great teacher, and we were thinking about these texts lots and saying them out loud, and it got into my head such that it was kind of as if I knew it. And then the way that I began to interrogate that text was like I instinctively personally identified with it. I ended up doing a fair amount of kind of thinking about it. What does that mean? And then I looked a little bit further myself. And then I was, surprised on any reflection that those would be the proof text for loving kindness. And then I think really I got to know it better in two ways: by learning it with other people, right? And hearing people say, wait, how can that be an act of loving kindness? And then eventually coming round to a sense that maybe loving kindness involves a kind of creative fight for loving kindness, and also just reflecting on my life as well. And really thinking about why is language and Torah so important to me, and how is that bound up with my love of people and my love of my dad? And I think it probably was over years actually, but I guess that's partly what I prize, is holding on to texts that I really love, snippets, right? So that they kind of reverberate within you a little bit, and also teasing them out with other people, which exactly as you say is so different to, I see this and I disagree with this, and so therefore I'm going to continue to just leave it aside, right? Which we do with Torah, and I'm very sympathetic to that because I have all sorts of privilege, right? And it's not for me to say like, oh, that text will not feel sexist if you really mine it, right? I recognize, and I also still feel with Torah, especially in all our texts, that I just would love us to be growing a culture of trust of the person opposite us, and determined trust of the text, such that we will bring the humane out of it.
That's really interesting. I'm glad that you brought that point up of it's going to be hard for someone who sees text as difficult, or they don't have privilege in relation to the text, whether it be sexist or homophobic or something exclusionary. Say a little bit more about that for me. How do you nurture that relationship when sometimes the text, the bits in between, Rabbi Simlai talks about the beginning and the end, but the bits in between sometimes don't reflect that. So just tell me a little bit more about how that works for you and how other people could learn from that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's the beginning and the end. And one of the classic commentaries on this is partly Rabbi Amiel, the former 20th century chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, says, and that also means all the middle as well, right? So I do think we're being taught a dynamic here, both for our lives, actually, for the way we approach difficulty in our lives, and the way we approach difficulty in the person opposite us, and the way we approach difficulty in the Torah. And I do have a kind of fundamental faith in people and in Torah, but I think with any moment, I trust the human being to derive something powerful out of that moment of Torah, however challenging. I heard Rabbi Art Green talk about this, that a colleague had said, oh, of course, we need those moments of the Torah that can feel painful so that we can preach against them, right? And I think there's something powerful there, right? Although the language is maybe still a little stark, right? I've come across enough, and I think really the key for me is that modality of drash, to interrogate the text, to creatively take out of the text. It's actually a way of being in the world that I feel we learned from Rivka in the Torah portion just a couple of weeks ago. She's in great pain, right? She prayed for children, and then she suffers great pain, and she laments, well, what sort of role have I been put in all my life? And this is how it culminates. And it says she went and drushed the eternal, v'telech lidrosh et Hashem. And to come from, as soon as you drush, you bring yourself and your pain, and you're determined to wield that text such that you might find that an eye for an eye actually means monetary compensation, right? Such that you might find that a text is completely the opposite of how you read it, and that's still Torah. Right? Because the Torah begins and ends with the act of loving kindness. If it seems like it's harsh or it's cruel, then we're going to just read it again and actually bring out something that is deeply humane and right.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think that's really vital to hear. That lens to look through it is important. I'm thinking about the imagery of this text and also the characters in it. When I first read it, when you sent it through, the one thing that struck me was a feeling of being held and being kind of clothed, either by the clothing at the beginning by God, or by the kind of letting go of death, the clothing of a burial of the ground that can kind of cover us when we depart from this world. And that felt kind and warm, even though the context of the story isn't. My question to you, though, is God in this story seems to, we often see God as the character, the power that orchestrates what's going on in these stories. It's presented as if God has cursed and now God provides protection. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what God's role is in this story. God seems to have most of the power, but uses that power to clothe, to bury, but also uses it to curse and to create the situations that are difficult. So I just wanted to just hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. So obviously, I prize those moments of repair and kindness within the difficulty. The divine severity in these moments, I understand partly as an invitation to appreciate the severity of the world and of life sometimes, you know, that this is part of life. You know, there is a way of reading this claim about loving kindness, that even the punishment is somehow kind, right? If we think about God's role, I mean, it's interesting you say you're, you know, really interested in God's role, and it's partly protective, because I think arguably in both cases, it's a parental role partly here. I mean, certainly kind of clothing those babies of humanity, and then heaven forbid, and you know, it's something that I've seen already in my rabbinate, but heaven forbid that parents bury children. But even in that later text, I think there's still a sense of divine parenthood. Yeah, I guess when it comes to God's role, I'm a little uncomfortable that this is all carrot, and you know, there's kind of the punishment is there to bring out the kindness, although we could part see that. I think what I really appreciate in these texts is the sustainability of the relationship, you know, with God, with Torah, with people. When something's difficult, it feels almost broken. You know, it could have been that Bereshit chapter 3 would have ended and the Torah would have ended, right? You know, no more relationship. But it's really out of those challenges that this relationship grows and that we grow.
Beautiful. Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. I think seeing God in the story potentially as presenting the harshness of the world as opposed to creating it in some sense. This is the world, and here are the clothes with which to kind of support you. This has been really fantastic. A really difficult text, I think, to see in terms of God's role in our lives, but also how to relate to texts that aren't always easy to look at them with a positive eye. I think it's clear from what you're saying that Torah, Judaism, text should be learnt together, face to face, and treated as such. But thank you so much for this. Do you have a last thought?
Well, no, thank you, Joe. I mean, with Thanksgiving, and yeah, this has been a real pleasure. Very grateful for this opportunity to talk and learn together. Yeah, and well done to JW3 and Limmud. This great thing.
As always, a pleasure to learn with you and also to learn with our audience. Join us next week for the last episode of It Says What with artist and educator Jacqueline Nichols. We look forward to seeing you there, and have a wonderful Shabbat and a wonderful week.